I always thought I understood my parents. I thought loyalty meant something, that decades of sacrifice counted for more than charm and a smile. But when the will was read, and my brother's name echoed in every line, every asset, every memory, it felt like my life had been erased in a single breath. They left him the mansion, they left him the money, they left him everything. People told me to let it go, that I didn't need a house to prove I was loved. But they didn't grow up in that house. They didn't scrub its floors after Mom's chemo, or fix its windows when Dad couldn't climb the ladder anymore. I was there. He wasn't. And yet, somehow, he was the chosen one. It took me months to uncover why. But once I did, I realized the mansion was never really his to keep. I can still remember the sound of that old clock ticking in Mr. Tanner's office. Every tick seemed to land on my chest like a quiet hammer. It was the kind of sound you don't really notice until you're trying not to cry. The room smelled faintly of wood polish and stale coffee. The blinds were half closed, letting in slivers of morning light that cut across the shelves stacked with thick folders and law books. I sat there, my hands folded neatly in my lap, trying to keep them still. My brother Michael sat beside me, legs stretched out, confident as ever, the picture of someone who'd already made peace with what he was about to hear. Mr. Tanner adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat, the sound muffled by the quiet hum of the air conditioner. "First of all," he began, "your parents wanted me to express their gratitude and love to both of you. They were proud of the family they built." My lips pressed into a thin smile. I knew the kind of words that came before bad news, soft, padded ones that tried to sound comforting. He turned a page, eyes scanning the paper. "As per their wishes, all primary properties and financial holdings are to be transferred to your brother, Michael Whitmore." There was a pause. I heard the words, but they didn't seem to belong to me. It was like they floated just above my head, unreal and distant. Michael nodded once, his expression polite, controlled. He even managed a little sigh, the kind you make when you want to appear humble. Mr. Tanner continued reading, his voice careful, deliberate. "The Whitmore Mansion at Lakeshore Estate, along with its adjoining land, investment accounts and family trust, are hereby bequeathed to Michael Whitmore in perpetuity." I felt my fingers tighten around each other until my knuckles ached. "Then mansion, the land, the trust, all of it. And to their daughter, Clara Whitmore," he said finally, "a financial sum of $50,000 for her comfort and well-being." Comfort, that was the word he used. $50,000 for my comfort. The silence that followed was heavy. Mr. Tanner's pen scratched faintly as he turned the last page, but all I could hear was the pounding in my ears. I kept my face still, smiling faintly as if I'd expected this all along. It was a trick I'd learned over a lifetime, how to keep my voice steady when everything inside me trembled. Michael leaned back in his chair, cleared his throat, and said softly, "Well, that's certainly generous of them." I almost laughed. Generous. Mr. Tanner looked up from the papers, awkward, as if waiting for me to say something. I nodded, managing to find my voice. "That's what they wanted," I said quietly. "That's what they wanted," he repeated, almost like a reassurance. He talked for a while after that, something about legal transfers, signatures, estate divisions. I couldn't follow any of it. I just stared at a small photo frame on the shelf behind his desk. It showed a younger Mr. Tanner standing beside his wife and two smiling children, somewhere by a lake. They looked so ordinary, so untouched by the kind of disappointment that was currently settling over me like dust. When the meeting finally ended, Michael stood and extended his hand toward me, all formal and composed. "You okay, Clara?" he asked, like he was the one offering sympathy. I smiled. "Of course. It's what they wanted." He hesitated for a second, then patted my shoulder. "You know they always trusted me with the practical stuff. You've always had such a soft heart, and they probably didn't want to burden you." I nodded again, that same brittle smile frozen in place. That must be it. We stepped out into the bright morning sun, and for a moment I felt dizzy. The air smelled like spring, cut grass, warm pavement, a hint of lilac from the planters outside the office building. Everything looked so normal. People walked by, laughing, holding coffee cups, rushing to wherever they needed to be. No one could have guessed that my whole understanding of family had just split in two. Michael's car, a sleek, silver BMW, was parked near the curb. He jingled his keys, smiling like he'd just come out of a successful business meeting. "Let's grab lunch sometime soon," he said casually. "We should talk about the house. There are taxes, maintenance, all that boring stuff." "The house," I repeated softly. "Of course." He opened his car door, gave me a little wave, and drove off, tires humming smoothly against the pavement. I stood there watching the car shrink in the distance until it disappeared around the corner. When I finally walked back to my own car, an old sedan that rattled every time it started, I caught a glimpse of myself in the rearview mirror. I didn't look sad exactly, more hollow, like someone who had been emptied out. The drive home took less than 20 minutes, but it felt like hours. My parents' town had always looked beautiful in spring, the willow trees bending over the streets, the old white fences lining the yards, the quiet rhythm of a life that never seemed to change. I'd grown up thinking this place would always be home. When I pulled into my driveway, I sat there for a while, engine off, staring at my hands. They looked smaller than I remembered, tired. I thought about all those years, every errand I ran for my parents, every doctor's visit, every holiday dinner I planned so they wouldn't have to. And for what? A check that barely covered one of the mansion's chandeliers. Inside, the house was still. I poured myself a cup of coffee, though I didn't really want it, and sat by the window watching the lake in the distance. The water shimmered under the sunlight, calm and endless, like it didn't care who owned what. From where I sat, I could almost see the outline of the Whitmore mansion across the hill. It wasn't the money that hurt, it was what it meant. That somewhere along the line I'd stopped being a daughter and had become a footnote. I thought about calling Michael, asking him why. But the truth was, I already knew what he'd say. He'd twist it into something practical, something reasonable. That's what he was good at, turning betrayal into business. So instead, I sat there staring out the window until the light began to change. The day slipped quietly into evening, and I found myself looking through old photo albums I hadn't touched in years. There we were, Michael and me on the front steps of the mansion, holding melting ice cream cones. He was maybe 8, me 11. Our mother stood behind us, smiling faintly, but I noticed something I hadn't before. Her arm was wrapped around Michael, not me. Her eyes, even in that faded photo, were turned his way. A strange chill moved through me. In another photo, years later, my father stood proudly with Michael at his high school graduation, both of them wearing matching suits. I was behind the camera, the one taking the picture. That had always been my role, watching, supporting, staying quiet. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing Mr. Tanner's voice in my head. All primary properties and financial holdings are to be transferred to your brother. The words circled like a slow carousel that wouldn't stop spinning. Around midnight, I got up and walked outside. The air was cool, the grass damp beneath my slippers. I looked toward the distant lights of the mansion glowing faintly on the other side of the lake. From here it looked peaceful, golden even, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something inside it was rotten. I thought about what my mother had said the last time I saw her alive. She'd been lying in her hospital bed, weak but lucid. She'd reached for my hand and whispered, "Take care of your brother, he's fragile, Clara." Fragile. I'd nodded, promising I would. But standing there in the dark, I realized she hadn't meant fragile as in weak. She meant fragile as in dangerous, the kind of person whose comfort you protect because the truth might break him. I went back inside, my heart pounding with a mix of anger and curiosity. There had to be more to it. People don't just erase one child out of their will without reason. As I stood in my kitchen, the moonlight spilling across the counter, I made a silent promise to myself. I would find out why. Whatever secret my parents had been guarding, whatever they'd built this illusion of fairness around, it was time to uncover it. I poured myself another cup of coffee and sat by the window again, this time watching not the lake, but the mansion beyond it. The house looked like it was watching me back, its dark windows gleaming faintly under the moonlight. Somewhere in there, hidden beneath all those years of polished floors and family dinners, was the answer, and whether it brought me peace or pain, I was finally ready to hear it. When I close my eyes, I can still see them, small sunlit moments that felt ordinary then and strange now. There's a picture I keep on the mantel. The edge is already soft, from being handled 1,000 times. It's Michael at 13, grin wide, hair messy, leaning against Dad like the world couldn't touch him. Dad's arm is slung over his shoulder, that proud, easy smile he reserved for Michael. I was behind the camera, of course, the one who always ended up taking the pictures. That's the thing about me. I learned early how to be the quiet anchor. I learned to step back so others could shine. I thought it was love. I thought it was duty. I thought it was how families worked. As the years passed, the pattern settled into place like a comfortable chair. Michael charmed his way through school, skipping weeks at a time when he'd get some scheme in his head or head off on one of his impulsive trips. He'd call home in a rush, asking for money, for a place to crash, for someone to bail him out of whatever small trouble he'd found. And mostly someone did. Not Dad. Dad wasn't the one who rushed to fix his mistakes. That role somehow kept falling into my lap. There were evenings, I remember, with aching clarity, the house full of that stubborn, ordinary noise of life. Plates clinking, the radio murmuring in the kitchen, Mom putting a casserole in the oven. Michael would swagger in late, throw his jacket on the back of a chair, grin in that way that made you forget the fact he'd been gone for days. Mom's face would light up when she saw him. It was like a small sun rising in the room. "There he is," she would say, and everything else would tilt toward him. It wasn't always so simple. There were times I resented him. I resented his easy way with people, his natural ability to be forgiven. I resented that when he messed up, it tended to slide off like water off a goose's back. When I brought home my first paycheck after college, I remember being proud, and quietly, almost with a guilty pleasure, telling Mom I could help with bills now. Mom smiled at me, her hands over mine, and said, "You don't have to, dear. You've done so much as it is." I felt a pinch, like a small bruise that never quite healed. I was the one who drove Dad to chemo when his hands could no longer hold a steering wheel. I washed his shirts, held his hand through nights of fever, read his notes and prescriptions until the letters blurred. Michael visited sometimes, polite and warm, but he was a guest in our suffering. He'd bring jokes in a takeout container, and for a weekend he'd be the life of the old house. Then he'd vanish again, and the house would settle back into the painstaking rhythm of care, the early morning pills, the quiet adjustments of a life made small by illness. They loved him in a way that made sense at the time. He was buoyant, where we were weighed down. He was the possibility of escape, the idea that things might be easier, brighter. I understood that, but there was always a line, a quiet dividing line that I didn't see until much later. When Dad would get tired in the evenings and sit by the window, sometimes I'd catch Mom looking at him with a kind of exhaustion in her eyes I hadn't noticed before. She would lull Michael to some joke, laugh easily, and then when Michael had left the room, she'd sit very still. The smile would hang, but her eyes would go distant, as if she were remembering a long, complicated thing she didn't quite want to say. Those little things accumulated. A folded hand here, a sigh over the casserole there. Mom would fuss over Michael's collar, fix a loose button, and I'd be the one washing the dishes later. I didn't mind at first. I thought this was how love looked. Small, unpaid labor, the quiet tending. But somewhere along the way, the pattern hardened into expectation. I noticed how people began to take my presence for granted. It was subtle at first, Mom assuming I would be the one to handle a phone call, a bill, a doctor's appointment. Then those assumptions felt less like gratitude, more like rules. There are times I replay the family dinners in my head, little snapshots of the way their faces arranged themselves. In one photo taken at Christmas, Michael stands in the center, scarf thrown casually over his shoulder, a mischievous glint in his eye. Mom's hands are on his arms, adoring, almost reverent. Dad stands a little behind, proud in the way only fathers can be when they see the son they've always hoped for. And me? I'm at the edge of the frame, adjusting someone's napkin, caught mid-movement. I don't even look at the camera. I look to the side, doing something useful. That picture used to make me smile. Now it stings. When they grew older, the imbalance didn't improve. If anything, it became fossilized. Michael's missteps were explained away. He has a good heart, people would say, or he's just going through a phase. I would hear that phrasing in conversations, the way they softened his edges into something forgivable. Meanwhile, anytime I tried to take initiative, Mom would say with delicate concern, "Oh, Clara, you work too hard." The message was always the same. You are the steady one. He is the bright one. He is the bright one. You are the caretaker. He is the center. I thought perhaps my parents saw something in Michael that I didn't. Maybe there was some spark that made them forgive and protect him in a way they didn't extend to me. Maybe they felt he needed saving. Still, there was an undercurrent of weariness in their faces that I never fully understood. In old photos, Mom's smile sometimes looks forced, like someone holding together a garment with a safety pin. Dad's shoulders sagged a little in the background of those same pictures. It was as if some secret weight had been pressing on them, and they used their adoration of Michael like a bandage, covering, comforting, but not healing. I began to pay more attention to the things that weren't said. I noticed how Dad would listen to Michael's wild plans with an indulgent smile, but when I suggested something practical, like consolidating medical appointments or rearranging the house for comfort, his brow would furrow, and he'd say, "We should think about Clara's ideas too." It was that sideways mention that mattered. It was the formal nod to fairness that made everything else feel less fair. My practical concerns were framed as courtesy, while Michael's whims were framed as charm. Sometimes when I was alone in the quiet of the house late at night, I'd walk past the study. The door was always shut when guests were around, but in those hours it seemed like the heart of the home. Papers, a scuffed leather chair, the smell of old tobacco and wood. I would stand at the threshold and listen to nothing, making up stories about how the past must have felt for them. I imagined Dad younger, full of ambition, shutting the door after a long day and unzipping a suitcase he feared to open in front of his children. I'd imagined Mom at the sink, staring into the window, as if trying to see across years to some unspoken compromise they'd made. Those imaginings felt like pieces of a puzzle I couldn't yet assemble. I tried to be generous in how I viewed them. I wanted to believe there was a reason that my parents seemed to put Michael on a pedestal. Perhaps it was guilt over something I didn't know. Perhaps it was a shame they kept in their chests. Or perhaps there was a kindness here, and I had been too quick to read it as neglect. But each time I tried to tell myself a kinder story, the photographs on the mantel pushed back. I found myself scrutinizing them more often, searching for the truth in the shadows and the tilt of a head. There was one photograph I couldn't stop looking at, a faded Polaroid of a summer picnic, kids with grass stains on their knees, and Mom's hair caught in a stray breeze. Michael is in the foreground, laughing with a swing of his arm. Mom's hand rests on his shoulder, her fingers splayed like she's holding him steady. Dad stands slightly to the side, smiling, but his eyes have always been the trouble. There's a weariness there, a sharpness that sometimes looked like sorrow. It made me wonder who he was protecting and why. Pieces of memory came back, odd shapes at the edges of things I hadn't realized were important. I remembered a neighbor once whispering about a woman who'd worked in the house when they were young, someone who'd left suddenly. I remembered Dad coming inside after a long night and sitting very still, as if he'd been listening to something I couldn't hear. I remembered Mom clutching a handkerchief and excusing herself from the table to the quiet of the hall. These were small things, almost imperceptible, the kind of details that dissolve, unless you look for them. Curiosity is a peculiar thing. It begins as a pinprick, an awareness that keeps you awake at night, then grows into a tangible ache. The more I looked at those old photos and replayed those memories, the more that ache demanded an answer. My quiet life, one of dutiful presence and unseen labor, had never felt quite like enough. I'd given my time, my energy, my youth. I'd always assumed the ledger of our lives balanced in ways I could never fully see. But the will, Mr. Tanner's careful, cold words, had shown me a balance that was skewed in a way that no one bothered to explain. So I started asking questions. Not the angry kind. Never angry. There was no room for spectacle in the way I felt. It was quieter than that. I found myself making small errands that put me closer to the mansion, stopping to talk to the old gardener, who'd worked there for decades, catching up with neighbors of the church bazaar, and listening. People divulge odd things in the spare moments between hellos and goodbyes, little facts about who took which, turn and why. Someone finally said something that made me pause. Mrs. Delaney, who'd been our neighbor since the town was small and the lake was cleaner, mentioned casually over the fence, "You know, Clara, there was someone here once. Seemed your mother and that woman had more than just work between them. People talked. They were careful, though." She said it like she was offering a bowl of sugar, simple, unobtrusive, like gossip, that needed to be passed along because it helped stitch days together into stories. I went home with that tiny spark in my chest. More pictures, more whispers, more fragments assembled. Each small thing fit into a larger pattern that was beginning to look less like chance and more like design. The feeling wasn't solely about being hurt. It was about finally seeing, about recognizing that what had always been framed as love and forgiveness might have had other names: secrecy, protection, and the heavy weight of a family's pride. I don't know yet what that pattern will lead to. I only know that the more I look, the less satisfied I am with the answers I was given. There's a sense that something is tucked away in the rooms of the mansion, papers, letters, and explanation, something that might make sense of the obvious unfairness I was given at the reading. So I keep scanning the photos, keep speaking to old neighbors, keep letting the faint ache of curiosity grow into a quiet resolve. The house across the lake sits like a bright island, and I'm finally ready to step across the water, not to take revenge with shouts, but to find whatever truth hides in that stately place. I'm not certain what I'll find, only that I can't keep living with the questions. The past has a way of opening its mouth when you insist on listening. The drive over felt like stepping back into someone else's memory. The Whitmore mansion rose up the hill like it always had, proud and a little too bright against the late afternoon sky. Ivy crawled up the stone pillars, and the long driveway still held the faint impressions of years of family cars. For a moment, standing at the edge of that familiar lawn, I felt the old, complicated mixture of comfort and ache. This was the house that had held every birthday and every fight and every patch of ordinary life. It was mice in memory, if not in paperwork. I told myself I was only there to collect a few mementos. An old clock from Dad's study, maybe a box of letters that I thought I'd misplaced. Mostly I wanted to feel the weight of the place beneath my hands, to see whether the air there smelled the same as it did when I was a child. I wanted to touch the fabric of my past, and know if it still fit. The front door was unlocked. Michael must have left it that way. He always left things easy for himself. The foyer smelled faintly of lemon polish and old varnish. The afternoon light made long rectangles on the hardwood floor, and the portraits that lined the staircase watched me like something living in a museum. I moved slowly, almost reverent, because the house felt fragile with memory. I didn't want to be the one to step too heavily. I passed the dining room where the long table had once held so many dinners we thought would last forever. The lace runner had been replaced by a more modern cloth, and the crystal chandelier caught the light differently now. But the place still felt like the echo of laughter. I told myself I wouldn't linger. I told myself I would be quick and practical. The study was at the back, Dad's domain. It had a seriousness to it, heavy books on the shelves, a globe in the corner, a map faded from the sun. The desk was the kind that anchors a room, dark wood with a leather blotter, the kind of thing people write wills upon, and then forget what the words sounded like. As I pushed the door open, the familiar scent of old paper hit me, musty and comforting in the way only libraries and long-lived rooms can be. I walked in and let my eyes adjust. The afternoon light fell across the desk, lighting the grain of the wood. On the left, Dad's green baker's lamp gave a small pool of amber. The chair behind the desk was pushed in but not tucked, as if someone had just stood up and stepped away for a moment. I ran a fingertip along the edge of the blotter and felt the roughness of long use. There was a side drawer that always stuck a little. I opened it, expecting to find the usual old receipts, a few envelopes with faded stamps, a rubber band or two. Instead, my hand brushed something tucked deeper, a seam in the wood I hadn't noticed for years. My fingers tracked along it like a child rediscovering a hidden toy. The seam gave under my touch, and a small panel eased open with a soft sigh. Inside was a stack of envelopes bound together with twine, the kind you find at the bottom of an old trunk. The handwriting on the top envelope jolted me. It was familiar and strange all at once. The name wasn't my father's. The letters were addressed to my mother. My breath caught in my throat, the way it does when you realize you've been holding your breath for some time and didn't know it. I sat down on the edge of the desk and untied the twine with hands that trembled just a little. The paper crackled in my lap like distant waves. The first letter inside was dated 23 years ago, when I was 20. The ink had faded to a soft brown, but the loops and flourishes were still clear, tender, almost urgent. My hands moved before my thoughts did. I read the opening line aloud without meaning to. My dearest Elsie, the nights here echo with your name. Elsie was my mother's name. I ran my thumb over the letters, tasting the silence that the page held. As I read more, a picture began to form, not of my father, but of someone else entirely. The words were intimate, full of small observations about my mother's laugh. Her hands, a joke she had once told. There was longing in the handwriting that made my chest ache. They were love letters. That realization hit me like a fist. Love letters to my mother, written while my father was away on business, during those long stretches he had spent in other cities. The letters spoke of stolen afternoons, the ache of goodbye, and promises made in shadowed doorways. They were not the kind of notes one leaves casually. They were the kind of confessions you tuck away in drawers and try to pretend you'll forget. They were written by someone who saw my mother in a way my father did not. I read a few more, skimming it first, then slowing, letting each sentence sink in. The name at the bottom of each letter was the same. Thomas. Not my father's name. Not anyone I recognized immediately. The handwriting wavered in places, the ink blotting where the author had paused, as if holding back tears. If I had never met you, one letter said, I might have lived a different life, but I would never have known what this longing felt like. Another read. You deserve more than the silence that keeps us bound. If ever the world makes this impossible, know that my heart will remain near. I felt the room tilt. The desk, the globe, the careful rows of law books. There were the props of a life that had concealed a second storyline beneath it. I thought of the nights Dad had come home late and sat with his newspaper until the small hours. I thought of the way my mother would press a finger to her lips when the phone rang at night. I thought of the strange quiet that used to fall over the house when certain shadows moved in. Questions crowded in like guests at a door. Who was Thomas? How long had this been going on? Did my father know? Did my mother? I flipped through the letters, tracing the arc of a hidden conversation. The tone changed over the years, from youth's bright hope to an exhausted, more resigned tenderness. Somewhere in the middle there were references to a woman named Agnes who had worked in the house, an assistant perhaps, who had gone away suddenly. The letters hinted at complications, apologies, and a promise to protect the ones who would suffer if the truth came out. I thought of Michael then, how he always seemed to arrive like a comet, intense, dazzling, and gone. Could he be connected to these letters? It sounded absurd, the sort of conjecture that romance novels toy with. But there was a small knot inside me that pulled at that possibility like a string, leading to an answer. I sat very still and let the letters speak, piecing together dates and mentions and small details like a puzzle. One letter, tucked near the back, was shorter, written in a hurry. They have decided, it read, and I must accept. For the sake of those I love, I will step away. But if anything ever happens, if the need arises, you must protect him. For both our sakes, keep him safe. The pronouns slid like ice under my fingers. The meaning stretched and broke in places. Protect him. Who was he? And why did that ask for protection ring like a key turning in a locked place? I felt a presence behind me and almost jumped, my hands instinctively folding the letters like a contraband. Michael had come into the study without a sound, as he tended to do. He looked older in the stale lamplight, the edges of his face carrying the years, and a handful of small comforts. "Finding anything interesting?" he asked casually, as if we were two siblings sharing an ordinary afternoon. I kept my face calm, perhaps better than I had a right to expect. "Just going through some of Dad's things," I said, voice steady. "Thought I'd take a look in the study." He leaned against the doorway, watching me. "You should leave the heavy stuff to the lawyers," he said with that easy grin. "We don't want to stir up dust." I swallowed, the letters hidden in my lap. "Michael?" I said, folding them with the care of someone handling a sleeping bird. "Did you ever notice these? The letters? Or does Dad never talk about the past?" He gave me a light laugh, and for a beat I thought I'd misread everything. "Dad? And the past?" he said. "He was always a man of forward plans. Why dig up old stones when the new land is doing just fine?" I watched him, searching for an edge I might miss. His eyes flicked to the desk, then away. For all his charm, there was a defensiveness there that tightened his jaw. "You look pale, Clara," he added. "Why don't you sit down? Take a breath." I should have asked him then. I should have said, "Do you know who Thomas is?" Instead, I felt the letters in my hands become both a shield and a sword. There was power in knowing and a greater power in choosing how and when to reveal what you knew. Rage and sorrow were quick temptations, but I didn't want to be a spectacle. I wanted answers. "Maybe later," I said softly, folding the twine back around the letters and tucking them into my bag. I wanted to leave with them. I wanted to be able to read them again where the light was kinder, and I could think without Michael's presence shaping my breath. I walked out of the study with the weight of the letters pressed to my chest like a fragile safety. The house seemed to watch me as I passed through, portraits with eyes that held both accusation and pity, carpets that had heard more than they should. Outside, the air felt cooler. The sun had begun to slide toward evening, painting the lake in a ribbon of molten gold. In the car, I lay the letters on the passenger seat and stared at the twine, feeling the slow bloom of a plan forming under the ache. The handwriting had given me a name, and the letters had given me a voice I hadn't known I'd had. A secret sits heavy when you first find it. Then, once held, it begins to reshape everything you thought you knew. There was so much to ask, and so many ways to ask it. I thought of the hidden drawer, the way the wood had given up its secret like a tired friend. I thought of my mother's hand in older photographs, and the way she'd sometimes watch Michael with a look I'd come to understand as complicated devotion. I thought of the sentence, "Protect him," and how it might have become a reason to put a mansion in someone's name rather than a simple inheritance. I started the engine and drove home slowly, the letters whispering beside me. The world outside looked the same, ordinary and unsuspecting, but the inside of my head was loud with new possibilities. Whatever the truth of those letters, it was now a piece of my history that I could not unknow. It opened my eyes in ways a reading of a will never could. At some point I had to decide how to use what I found. Questions were the currency now. Who, why, and at what cost? The letters didn't give me all the answers, but they gave me a path. A hidden drawer had handed me a key. I slid my hand over the twine and felt the future pressing against the past, and I knew I was about to go somewhere that would change everything. The portrait hung where it always had, above the staircase, in that quiet place where everyone passing through the house glanced at it without really looking. It was one of those old oil paintings, heavy with varnish and time. My parents, young and formally dressed, my father with his straight back, and my mother with that slight private smile she reserved for photographs. Michael wasn't in the painting. He'd been a late addition to the family story, and his face appeared only in the albums, in the Polaroids and framed snapshots that crowded the mantel. But on that afternoon, standing beneath that painting with a stack of letters still warm in my bag, something about the portrait seemed different. The room held its breath. I climbed the stairs slowly, each step creaking in the way they always had. The upstairs hall smelled faintly of shoe polish and the lemon oil we'd once used to keep the banister gleaming. Light from the high window slanted across the runner, making the paint on the walls look russet. I stopped in front of the portrait and let my eyes trace the lines of their faces the way I'd done 1,000 times. My father's chin was set like it always was, a stubborn, patient kind of jaw. My mother's eyes, even in the painted stillness, had that same gentle sadness that sometimes softened her laugh. It was only when I stepped closer that the oddness started to unfurl. At first it was a small thing, the way my parents' faces framed one another, the slight angle of my mother's head. Then I noticed it, behind the glass of the portrait frame, tucked between the backing and the stretcher, a corner of a photograph peered out like a secret waiting to be found. I touched the frame with a careful finger and felt the varnish's tiny bumps under my fingertip. My pulse sped in the familiar, disorienting way, curiosity giving way to the quiet dread that accompanies the feeling you're about to learn something irreversible. I eased the portrait forward, fingers going to the brass hook, and lifted it off the wall. The canvas was heavier than I remembered, and the back smelled of dust and that faint musty odor that lives in things that have remained untouched. I set it face down on the bed in the guest room and reached behind the stretcher with slow, almost reverent motions. That corner of paper slid free into my hand like a small, reluctant thing. It was a faded photograph, sepia at the edges, the kind you might find in a trunk from a different life. I turned it over. On the back was a scribbled date and a name I hadn't expected. Agnes. The name pricked something in my chest. Agnes, the woman Mrs. Delaney had mentioned once at the fence, years ago, as if she were sharing gossip over a loaf of bread. Agnes, who had worked in the house and then left. Agnes, whose departure, in my childhood, had been noted and then folded away. I sat on the bed, the portrait leaning against the headboard, and turned the phonograph over again. The image was of a kneeling woman, hands in a garden, hair piled in a loose knot, laughing at someone outside the frame. There was a softness around her mouth, a look of brave joy that made me ache. And then, in the background, half hidden by the blur of summer, a small boy stood on a fence post, his face turned just slightly toward the camera. He was too young for Michael in the photo, or too old, and something about the little boy's nose, the tilt of his head, the way his brows sat over his eyes, made my breath catch. I thought of the handwriting at the bottom of the letters, the name Thomas, curling like a private signature. I thought of the line I'd read before, "Protect him." Images began to stitch themselves together in my mind with the slow, certain logic of a puzzle. If Agnes had worked in our house and then left abruptly, if a name like Thomas had appeared in letters to my mother, then the pieces on the mantel and the pages in my lap started to align in a way that made my hands go cold. I compared the photograph to Michael's features the way you might compare a drawing to its reference. The same slope of the nose, the same small cleft just under the lower lip, the same set of eyes that somehow looked both familiar and separate from my father's. I laughed once, a small, helpless sound that quickly dried into something like grief. The idea felt both preposterous and inevitable. The boy on the fence might be Michael, or at least the boy from whom Michael inherited his face. My heart kept finding ways to name it before my mind would let me fully believe it. My mind circled the edges of what that would mean. If the letters were love letters to my mother from someone named Thomas, and if Agnes had been there, and if that small boy in the photograph shared the traits that Michael carried, then there was an explanation for why Michael had been treated like a treasure. Not because he was merely my parents' son, but because he was the living echo of an affair that needed protection, the child of a complicated secret kept under heavy roofs and quieter compromises. I felt a strange tenderness in that instant, not all at once, but in threads. For my mother, who had endured whatever private hunger had pulled her, for the woman in the photograph whose life had been complicated by proximity to a family that loved, but also contained secrets, and for Michael, who carried a life none of us had been fully honest about. My chest tightened with the sort of sorrow that comes from seeing human beings as layered, not as simple actors in a story you can neatly categorize. People are not only the parts they play in our memories, they are also the choices they made in the privacy of rooms where we were not allowed to sit. I smoothed the photograph with a steady hand, and then reached for the letters again, the way someone might reach for a torch in a dark room. The inked lines I'd read once with a tremble felt heavier now, because I could stitch them to faces and to the smell of the garden in that photograph. Words that had been merely moving ink took on context. If ever the need arises, keep him safe. Keep him safe from whom? From the scandal? From my father's knowledge, from the harshness of being an unacknowledged child in a house that preferred tidy narratives. My father had always been the one to hold the household upright in very visible ways, the payments, the stern talks, the plans for the future. But I remembered him in other moods too, quieter at odd hours, pulling an old photograph from a drawer, and staring as if trying to understand what he'd been given by a past he had not chosen. There had been moments when his face, once the color had leached from it, carried something like sorrow. I'd told myself it was the strain of bills and the heaviness of age, but perhaps there was another layer. Perhaps he had known, perhaps he had made a decision to bear a truth so that the ones he loved, all of them in their brokenness, could be protected. The realization was not a thunderclap. It was more like a slow creeping fog that cleared certain parts of the landscape by obscuring others. The mansion's glory began to read differently. The way my mother fussed over Michael's collars began to feel less like favoritism and more like careful tending. Where I had once felt overlooked for my quiet competence, I now understood there had been a calculus I'd never been privy to. Sacrifice can wear many masks. Protection can be mistaken for preference. When I finally stood and placed the photograph back behind the portrait, it felt like tucking a wound away. The frame was heavier now, laden with knowledge that made it difficult to hang. I slid the portrait back into position, the hook catching with a small click that sounded absurdly final. Below it the staircase seemed the same, but when I took my first step down, the runner felt like a timeline I'd been walking on all my life, suddenly aware of its seams. Outside the day had cooled. The house exhaled in the slight breeze that ran over the porch. I sat on the top step for a long time, the letters resting in my lap like a secretive warmth. I thought of the way my parents had always tried to keep everything tidy, appearances stitched so carefully they sometimes hid the seams. I thought of the little sacrifices Dad must have made. Quiet nods, small tolerations, and acceptance that sometimes the peace of the household required a truth left unspoken. Anger rose and fell within me like tide and trough. There was betrayal, certainly, the kind that stung and made my hands clench. But more than anger, perhaps, was a complicated compassion that I hadn't expected to feel. My mother had loved in ways that had entangled her, and my father had protected a family in ways that were both noble and heavy. Michael had inherited a mansion and a mantle, not simply because he charmed his way into it, but because the history of our family had been negotiated in rooms where I had not been invited to sit. The letters, the photograph, the painted faces above the stairs, they rearranged the story I'd told myself my whole life. I had spent years assuming neglect where there might have been concealment, assumed favoritism where there might have been protection. That was not excusing the fact that I had been hurt. It was only enlarging the frame in which hurt, love, secrecy, and duty had been operating. I folded the letters carefully and slid them back into my bag. There would be time to read them again, time to map dates and names and to trace the evidence with a steadier heart. For now I needed to breathe and let the discovery settle. Revelations like these have a way of reshaping your posture. They set the body in a new alignment. What once fit no longer does. I paused at the bottom of the stairs, looking back up at the portrait that watched over the house like a slow, steady witness. My next step, whatever it might be, would not be hurried. I had been given a key, a set of clues hidden in handwriting, and a photograph tucked behind varnish. The truth was not a weapon I wanted to swing in fury. It was a tool that might build a certain kind of justice, one grounded in truth rather than spectacle. Outside, the light was changing toward evening. I could see the glint of the lake in the distance, a ribbon of silver that had always separated our house from the world in the gentlest way. In that thin, cooling air, I felt the tilt of my life change. I had found a door. I had a choice about how to open it. The sound of my shoes on the steps was steady as I walked out to the driveway, the letters heavy and certain in my bag. The next person I would speak with would be Michael, and I knew with a clarity that calmed and sharpened me at once that when I told him what I'd found, everything would be different. I told myself I would go slowly. I'd rehearse what to say, find the calmest words I could, and not let the hurt make me clumsy. There is a particular kind of quiet you learn when you've been the one who holds things together for decades. It helps you frame hard truths without breaking the people who will hear them. That was what I hoped for that morning as I drove up Michael's long driveway, the magnolia branches shading the path like polite hands. The house looked the same as always from the outside, tall windows catching the sun, the stone steps polished by many footsteps. Inside, though, there was a different air. Michael had stacked comforts around him, a modern coffee maker on the kitchen island, abstract paintings on the walls, a leather couch that absorbed the sound of footsteps. The place felt arranged to be admired. He met me in the foyer with a practiced smile, the kind of smile that's been polished for social weather. "Clara," he said, embracing me almost formally. "I'm glad you came. Coffee. Sit wherever you like." He led me to the kitchen where sunlight spilled across a small breakfast table. The kettle clicked off with an unhurried sound. The smell of fresh roast filled the room. He set 2 cups down between us and sat opposite, elbow on the table, leaning forward in that way that made people think he was fully present. I watched him for a long moment, letting his features settle into my mind. The same smile I'd known since childhood, but now softened at the edges by the weight of years and the curious slack of someone who hasn't had to work too hard to maintain his ground. "Michael," I began, and my voice was steadier than I felt. "I found some letters at home." Blinked slow. "Letters? From Dad?" His tone was wary, a trace of the old defensive charm surfacing. He folded his hands and waited, as if for a trick. "Not exactly," I said. "They were in a hidden drawer in Dad's study. They were addressed to Mom. They were love letters." I watched his face for the flicker of reaction, the way someone tries to keep a window firmly closed, but feels a draft slip through anyway. "You're joking," he said too quickly. He laughed once hollow. "Clara, this sounds like something out of a—" "I wish I were," I said gently. I pulled the folded papers from my bag and laid them on the table between our cups. The old twine still wrapped them like a binding. "They're signed by a man named Thomas. They speak about secret meetings. A woman named Agnes, who worked in the house, promises to protect a child." My hands did not shake when I touched the letters. I wanted my hands to be solid for both of us. Michael's mouth went dry. He looked down at the paper, then away, fingers drumming a nervous rhythm on the table. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. "Where did you get these?" "From Dad's desk," I said. "A hidden compartment. I thought they were part of some old correspondence. But then I found a photograph tucked behind Mom's portrait. A woman named Agnes, a little boy in the background. The face, Michael, it looked like you." He swallowed. For a long beat, neither of us spoke. Outside, a lawn sprinkler hissed in the heat, and the sound was oddly loud in the kitchen. The air between us was thick with things we hadn't named. "You're lying," he whispered finally. The words came out small, almost hopeful. His hands trembled just a little when he reached for his coffee mug, and I saw the tremor as clearly as if it had been painted on glass. "You're making this up to hurt me." I set my hand on his, and didn't pull away. The touch seemed to surprise him, as if affection was an unanticipated currency in that moment. "I'm not trying to hurt you," I said. "I'm trying to give you context. You have a right to know." His eyes flicked up, wet at the edge. The arrogance I'd known all my life softened, then cracked. "If this is true," he said, voice raw, if she was, then why didn't they tell me? Why did they lie?" His face folded into the wounded confusion of a man who suddenly had to relearn the ground beneath him. "Because they were protecting you," I said. "Because they were protecting the family." I thought of my father, how quietly he'd maintained the household, the small dignity of his daily routines, and of my mother, who'd worn a smile like a shield. They made choices no one asked for, Sometimes protection looks like secrecy. Sometimes people choose a lonely burden over a scandal they don't want anyone to shoulder. The words tasted like ash in my mouth even as I spoke them. He laughed, a small, incredulous sound. Protection. He looked down at the letters again as if seeing them anew. They gave me a mansion. They gave me their name. If that was protection, it was a strange kind. It was not a gift in the easy sense, I said. It was an arrangement made under pressure. There's a history here, between Mom and someone named Thomas and a woman who worked in our house. Dad carried something. They kept it inside because the alternative might have been worse for the child. I watched him, searching his face for the person who had once been my little brother, vulnerable and messy, and all his own. The expression that came over him was not the defiant grin I expected, but something fragile and stunned. He rocked back slightly in his chair, as if the revelation had physical weight. "So I'm not them," he began, and then stopped, the sentence collapsing into a spin of questions too complex to follow. I told him more then, but carefully. I read a few lines from one of the letters. Nothing scandalous, nothing designed to wound, but enough to show the texture of the affair, the hush of meetings, the worry, the plea to keep a child safe. I watched as the color left his cheeks, and then came back in a slow, shame-faced bloom. He covered his face with his hands for a moment, and exhaled as though he'd been holding his breath for years. "You have every right to be angry," he said at last, not at me, but into the table. "I would be if it were me." I shook my head. "I'm not angry for the reason you think," I said. "I'm not angry because I didn't get the house. I'm not angry because you were favored. I'm tired of pretending things were simpler than they were. But I don't need to take the mansion from you. That's not my aim." I could feel the steadiness in my voice like an anchor. "The house is yours, Michael. Keep it. But now you know what it cost." His hands dropped from his face slowly, and when he looked up, there were tears on his lashes. "What cost?" he whispered. The question was not about money. It was about all the invisible prices that had been paid over the years. Quiet compromises, hidden reputations, the small deaths of possibility in a family that tried to keep its image intact. "You know now," I said softly. "You know the letters, the photograph, the name of the woman. You know Dad kept something heavy for a long time. He made choices, hard ones, to protect someone he cared for. That shaped everything. It changed the way he looked at you, the way Mom looked at you. It changed what they thought fairness might mean." I wanted him to see that this was not a story with a single villain and a single victim. These were human choices, messy and imperfect. Michael's face crumpled then in a way that relieved me and frightened me at once. He reached across, took my hand, and squeezed it with a desperation that surprised him and me both. "I don't know how to be anything but the person they made me," he said, voice breaking. "I thought I had it all, figured out. Now it feels like everything is made of sand." "You weren't given all the pieces," I said. "None of us were. That's the terrible part." I kept my tone level gentle. I did not speak words of accusation. There was no pleasure in that. There was only a recognition that truth was now a wound that needed tending. You can choose what to do with it. You can be angry, or you can learn from it. You can let it make you smaller, or you can let it teach you something about the people around you. He sat there in the silence for a long while. I brewed another cup of coffee without thinking, and set it before him. He took it without looking up, fingers hovering over the handle as if unsure how to participate in a small, ordinary comfort. When he finally lifted his head, his eyes were red and distant. "I am so sorry," he said, not to me, but to the air of the room, to the ghost of decisions that had shaped his life. "I am so sorry to Mom and Dad, if they were hurting. I am sorry to you, Clara, if I ever made you feel less seen." He swallowed hard. I thought they loved me because I was special. I didn't see how it might have been because they were trying to save something. I nodded slowly, feeling the complex ache that comes when the person you thought you knew is revealed as both more and less than their image. Forgiveness in such moments isn't a gasp. It's a slow, practical thing. "I don't need an apology to feel better," I said. "I need honesty going forward. I need you to know the truth and decide what to do with it. That's mine to offer, not to punish." He let out a long breath, the sound of someone surrendering an old armor. "What will you do?" he asked, voice small. "What I've always done," I said. "I'll keep living. I'll stop pretending I'm okay with half-truths. I'll take a little space where I can think without being yanked by other people's needs." I smiled then, the kind of soft, tired smile that had come to me often in recent months. And I'll let you figure out how to be Michael with this knowledge. Don't make the mansion your shield. Don't turn it into a fortress that keeps you from feeling. Let it be a thing you steward with understanding." He nodded, tears finally escaping in earnest. He spoke then, words tangled and honest, of his own shame and confusion, of gratitude for having been told in a way that did not demonize him. He asked questions about dates and names and the people he'd never known. I told him what I knew, careful with details, aware that some truths belonged to other people's privacy as well. When I left his house that afternoon, we did not hug in the performative way we used to. We walked to the door with a new honest awkwardness. He reached out once, then let his hand fall. "Thank you," he said, "for telling me, for not tearing my life apart in public." "You're welcome," I said. "Take it slowly. Let it be a chance to see your family as whole, even with its flaws." The sun had softened by then, the light shifting to a more forgiving gold. I drove away with a sense of something settling, like a book finally closed after an uncomfortable chapter. The knowledge would sit between us now, a thing that altered the furniture of our relationship. It felt heavy, but it also felt right. In the car, I thought about what it means to reveal truth. Sometimes people imagine revelation as a dramatic unmasking, a roar. But most truths reveal themselves like this, quietly, in a small kitchen over coffee, with hands that tremble and eyes that water. The revenge some people crave is loud and punitive. Mine had never been that. I wanted Michael to know, to see, to have the option to change rather than to be punished by public scandal. As I drove the familiar road back toward the lake, the mansion loomed across the water, grand and silent in the late light. I felt no triumph in that sight, only a sober, clear understanding that now both of us would have to carry this differently. The knowledge did not erase the past, nor did it fix the years of being overlooked, but it did rearrange the truth in a way that might, someday, allow healing. The cottage by the lake was smaller than I'd imagined it would be in my head, but that was a good thing. It fit like a quiet sentence after a long, complicated paragraph. The porch leaned just enough to be charming. The pate had a few places where the wood showed through, and the windows caught the light in a way that made morning feel like a private gift. When I first walked in, I pressed my palm to the kitchen counter, the way you test water. It felt solid beneath my hand, and something in me took a slow, relieved breath. I spent the first few days unpacking the things I'd kept most carefully. Not the things that screamed for attention, but the small objects that carried a kind of domestic gravity. Henry's old coffee mug with the chipped rim, a stack of well-worn recipe cards, the photograph of Mom in her favorite dress. I put them on shelves and in drawers with a tenderness I hadn't allowed myself for years. It wasn't that I was starting over from nothing. It was more like rearranging the furniture of my life, so the rooms were mine to walk through without tripping over other people's expectations. Morning became my favorite time. I'd wake before the sun, make tea, and walk down to the water. The lake was patient and anonymous, reflecting back whatever mood I happened to bring. Steel gray on some days, a sheet of polished silver on others. I'd sit on a wooden bench that faced the water and fold my hands around the warm mug until the steam fogged the glass. The world was wide and contained, and in that wide smallness I learned how to breathe differently. I let the steady, even rhythm of the tide teach me a kind of pace I'd forgotten existed. Good teacher. The soil at the cottage was sandy and stubborn, not like the rich loam of my childhood flower beds. But it wanted company. I planted lavender and rosemary and a few tomato seedlings. There was a patience that went into it, digging, planting, covering, waiting, and then watching the slow miracle of green. My hands, which had once been busy with other people's needs, began to know the soft pleasure of tending something that responded only to care. When the first purple blooms opened, I stood in the sun and let their scent wash over me, and for a quiet second I felt like laughing at the simplicity of a life where my work might just be to water something each day. I wrote letters that I never mailed. In the early evenings, I would sit at a small oak table and let the pen find its way across the cream paper. Sometimes the letters were to Henry, silly little notes about how the teapot had finally stopped whistling. Sometimes they were to my mother, thanking her for the way she showed affection in small acts. Sometimes they were to no one at all, just thoughts set down where they could be examined without interruption. Writing became a kind of slow conversation with myself, a way to make sense of the knot of feelings that had been tied tight for so long. The letters lived in a box by the bedside, tied with soft twine, and whenever doubt crept in, I would take one out and read it like a map that helped me find the way back to myself. Michael came by sometimes, awkward at first, then a little steadier as the weeks went on. He'd stand in the yard beneath the willow, hands in his pockets, looking across the water toward the mansion like someone watching a life that was partly his and partly not. We talked about small things at first, the weather, the oddity of a storm that came in without warning. Then, on a warm afternoon, he sat on my porch steps and said, "You look different. Calm is a good color on you." Laughed because it was true. Ain't hurried had become part of my face. It took practice, I told him, and good dirt. He smiled then, and in that smile there was a strange blend of affection and contrition. He was not the same boy who had staggered into our lives like a comet. The knowledge of his origin had softened some edges and hardened others. I could see weariness under his charm. Grief had taught him humility in a way that vindication never could have. We stopped pretending everything was the same. There were afternoons when we would sit on the porch and not speak for long stretches, listening to the frogs and the occasional call of a distant gull. Silence, once a thing that felt heavy and accusing, had begun to mean something else. Companionable, respectful, a space not yet filled with words that might hurt before they healed. He told me about small changes he wanted to make at the mansion. I told him about the tomatoes that had surprised me by thriving. We acknowledged our losses without performing them for each other. The air between us felt clearer. The mansion across the lake kept its silhouette impressive and aloof. Sometimes I would see Michael standing at the upstairs window, a thin figure framed in glass watching the water. The sight stabbed me briefly, not because I wanted it for myself, but because I saw the shape of a man who had inherited more than walls and carpets. He had inherited an expectation, a history that had been dressed up as gift. In the beginning, watching him made my chest ache in old ways, a hollow sound I thought I'd fill with the day's work. But over time the ache softened into a kind of sad satisfaction. The mansion could sit there with its grandeur. It could be the vessel for his new learning. I had my small cottage, my garden, my quiet mornings. Peace had a price that for me felt fair. Neighbors waved in that easy, respectful way that small towns have. Mrs. Adler next door brought over a pie one afternoon just because, and we talked about recipes and tomatoes, like we had plenty of time for such things. There was a local book club at the library that met once a month, and on a whim I went and listened to women talk about the small tragedies in fiction that felt oddly like our real lives. I found comfort in their normalcy. It was not that my life had been extraordinary. It was that I had been given a different kind of attention, to see, to rest, to be mundane. Sometimes at night I would look across the dark water and see a single light in the mansion go out, then come back on, then go out again. It felt like a distant heartbeat. I thought of my father often in those early days at the cottage, his stubbornness, his quiet rituals, his sacrifices laid like stones across the family path. The letters I'd found at the desk changed how I saw him. Not as a betrayer, not wholly, but as a man who had chosen a way to keep his household together that required expensive silencers. It was not the heroism I had imagined. It was a human attempt to keep peace, and that was complicated enough. I had visitors other than Michael. Old friends dropped by, people who'd known me before the will and the letters, and who saw me as I had been, neighbor, organizer of church suppers, someone who could be relied upon to show up. They brought casseroles and gossip about the town, and asked about my garden as if it were the most interesting thing in the world, which, for that moment, it was. Their presence steadied me. It reminded me that life had many small tenders, people who offer what they have because it's their nature, not because someone asked for it. Once, a young woman from the Historical Society came by, asking to photograph the lily pond that used to be part of the mansion grounds. She wanted to document what the lake looked like across the decades. We talked about the old days, about picnics and bands playing on the hill, and I told her some small stories that felt lighter to tell now. Telling them felt like handing an old worry across the counter. It was no longer mine to lug alone. The truth is, freedom wasn't immediate. There were nights when the quiet felt like a question. What did it mean to be free of the weight I'd carried for so long? There were moments when I resented the ease with which others resumed their lives, as though my years of care could be repaid by a smile and a thank you. But those feelings were passing storms. The steady weather of days watered by routine and small satisfactions did more to reshape me than any single dramatic moment. I kept writing the unsent letters. Sometimes I wrote to Michael and tucked the pages into an envelope that remained unmailed. Often I wrote to my younger self, the one who had thought hiding your needs was the noblest kind of love. Those letters became maps, drawing out the route I'd walked and the ways I'd changed. I learned to read them with gentleness. They were not indictments, but testimonies to endurance and growth. One late afternoon, summer leaning toward autumn, I saw Michael walking along the path near the water's edge, hands behind his back, looking at his own reflection in the lake. He paused, then walked up toward my porch. He carried with him a slow intentionality that made me think of the way people move when they've finally decided to do a hard thing. He handed me a small potted rosemary plant. "For your garden," he said simply. We planted it together in a patch of earth that hummed a little as we pressed it down. His touch was steady, respectful. He didn't ask for permission to be near. He didn't ask for absolution. He offered a small thing, and small things are often the truest currency. "You look good here, Clara," he said after a while, not probing for promises, but speaking truth. "You look at peace." I smiled, feeling something in me loosen and then straighten like a breath finally out. "I do," I said, "and I'm glad you came by to see it." He nodded, and there it was. The simple shared human relief that two people feel when something hard has been acknowledged, and they can go on. The mansion across the water held its own lessons. It would teach Michael, if he let it, about stewardship and about how an inheritance can be both a gift and a burden. I would keep my garden and my letters and my quiet mornings, choosing each day what to spend my energy on and what to let go. For all the anger and the sting of years, there was a steadier reward now. I had clarity about the past, and a life I could tend as I pleased. I had evidence that truth, once found, need not be used to wound. It could be used to understand. Sometimes the most radical thing you can do after being wronged is to take care of yourself, to choose small joys deliberately, and to let the loud needs of the world recede in favor of what keeps you whole. If this story reached someone who's been holding too much for too long, I hope it whispers a small permission. You don't always have to repay love with martyrdom. Sometimes the kindest justice is to build a life that honors your needs. If this quiet chapter of mine touched you, please consider sharing it with someone who might need the reminder. If you'd like to hear more stories like this one, soft, true, and focused on the quiet ways people heal, please subscribe and join me for the next tale. Thank you for listening and for making room to sit with me by the lake.